I'm excited about this talk because originally Elm was a little graphics library because I was frustrated about vertically and horizontally centering things. And ultimately, I wasn't able to figure out how to make that work. So I'm very excited to hear from Matt about ideas along these lines.
Hello. Okay. So my name is Matt Griffith, and this talk is about building a better design toolkit. So this talk is about a library that I made actually a few years ago now, which is kind of interesting. Thank you, Dan. Called Style Elements. And the original idea that I was playing around with was how can you make, I was kind of inspired by Elm, like how can you make layout like unbreakable, right? Like no runtime layout errors. And I realized that's kind of a weird way to frame it. And so there's kind of another way, which is I'm really excited about design systems. And by design systems, I basically mean Legos. Legos are really fascinating. They were like an integral part of my childhood, just like Anthony. And they just like sparked your imagination. You were able to kind of get into a flow of Legos, and you were able to build things. You were able to, and they had these like wonderful properties, right? So it's like everything fits together. It's like it's easy to build, and then it's easy to change. And because of that, because of those three properties that comes around, it's fun. And you can kind of just let your imagination kind of go wild. So if we kind of like fast forward into now, like this is the experience around Legos. What's the experience of designing with CSS? Is it any of these things? And so, like with this experience, usually what happens is it's kind of critical to the discussion between you and your designer, right? Or maybe that's just you internally. So you're like, okay, well, I got this idea. Maybe I've seen this cool layout, and it's really cool, and I'm really excited to implement it, or to have it rather. I'm not that excited to implement it. So you start implementing it. And what happens pretty quickly is you run into your bag of tricks, right? Like you have, like, you're like, okay, well, this should work. Like, everything that I know about CSS says this should work. It's still not working, and I don't know why. And so what you start doing is you start smashing things, right? And you start adding, like, okay, we're just this one time, we're gonna like translate a little bit up, or we're gonna like like go from block to flexbox, or maybe we should try grid. So like, what's the story around alignment? So we have this square. We're at the basic. We just have a square, and we want to align it to the left. How do we do that? Now, in CSS, we could look at any of these properties. And what's interesting is only one of them actually has the word left in it. But more importantly, I think, because, I mean, maybe that's an issue, maybe not. I think it's nice. Is that if you look at each one of these properties, and maybe you're familiar with them, you're likely familiar with them if you're here, or maybe you're not and you're just like, wow, this is crazy, is that each one of these has not just this property, but this all like set of roots that it goes around. There's a whole structure that has to be in place for any of these to work. They don't work by default. You can't just say like, oh, I'm going to float this thing left. It's like, well, there's a certain set of like conditionals that you need to meet for that actually to work out. And then maybe some things that you have to do maybe after the fact, like clear fix or whatever. So what if the story around this was just like, like go to the left, please? That would be pretty cool, right? And what's interesting too, again, we're talking about these roots. And we said with Legos, it works anywhere, right? What if this just worked anywhere? There are no roots. It's like this is the whole thing. It's a line left. Like there's no more structure we need to know. There's no more funky, spooky actions that need to happen. So I work at Cornell Tech as a research developer, not on this actually, but I actually sometimes take on freelance clients, and so I have this kind of experience that happened for the purpose of this talk, which is I was hired by 2 clients to actually make a new website. Now this picture was taken right after they just dropped their latest indie album, and this is Phoebe and Bardo, and they wanted to start a new endeavor. They wanted to make a website based around this new business idea called Cats the Gathering, a magical card game. And yeah, basically, that's Bardo. She's great. So the thing is though, is they had very little money, and they wanted to get this done quickly, and they didn't want it to break afterwards. They wanted it to look nice, and they wanted it to maybe this isn't the best idea, and they're going to get sued, so they want to pivot later, but with the same design. Kind of what would we want to do? Well, the first thing we'd want to do is we'd want to actually just make some text. It's okay, well, we need to write the logo, right? That we know the name of it, and we can just use a cool typeface, and we say okay, Cats the Gathering. Great, we have some text. It's okay, that's cool, but what if we want to we want to move it around? Well, we have to wrap it in an L, which is just short for element, but we use it everywhere, so it's shortened. And then we can attach some properties to it. So we can just say center X, center Y, we're there. And this example is sort of interesting because it's like in 1993, this was a big deal. And now it's okay, well, but I could just use Flexbox, and it's I put the thing in a Flexbox, and I know the justify content, justify items, I center it, and it's fine. But it's really that we can just kind of do wherever, right? Wherever we want to go. And this is nice. It's great, we're off to a pretty good start. So what's next? Well, obviously we don't just want one element, right? We want multiple elements. So what does that mean? So that means we need some sort of contract around layout, which is a fancy way of we need to be specific about what we're doing. So in this case, we're going to have a row. And it's okay, well, we got a row. It's we all know, flex direction row. I don't know how you can go in the direction of row, but sure. So we have this row now. And what's interesting is we have 2 little toggles. And you may be used to 2 similar toggles called padding and margin, right? But actually, in a lot of ways, they're the same toggle, which means they're fighting all the time. And you need to make this micro decision all the time. So when you're doing CSS, you actually get this sort of amalgamation of these micro decisions you have to make, and you're not going to be consistent no matter what you do, just because it's just not going to happen. So padding, we know this, right? It's okay, yeah, we got some padding, great. And spacing is just defined as the space between stuff. It's that's nice. If I were to actually describe this layout to somebody, and it's okay, there's a wall, you have to describe the layout, and they have to recreate it. You could say well, I have a row of 4 things. The second one says Cats the Gathering. There is some space, some padding on the outer edge. That's 36 units, and I got the spacing between each one is 83. And they'd be able to recreate this. You could toss this over the wall, and it would be recreated. But this isn't even that crazy. I mean, you can still think about how you would create this, right? It's okay, hold on. We know what's happening. We're adding a little margin, and the first one, we don't have the margin, and the rest of them, we have a margin on the side, and then we just move that. So I could make a SAS rule that does this. And it's okay, well, fair enough. And so we say width fill just meaning fill the space, and then we're okay, well, but we're making a nav bar, in case you didn't guess. That's what our row bar will turn into. And so if we have these things, we don't actually just want the known spacing. We want to actually take these 2 elements, and we want to say align right. It's okay, whoa, that was exciting. Like that just works. Like we can just say like it's on the right and this one's on the right too. And we can still like adjust spacing and it still feels really good. It's like, okay, well that's cool. Well, what about, our business changes in the middle of implementing our row because cats move really fast. And we've decided that we want to put a search bar in the middle. It's like, okay, well, could we just like add a search bar in the middle? That would be pretty cool. It's like, how would you actually do this in like CSS? It's like, well, you've probably done something similar, but it was probably like the structure was kind of crazy, and you realize you had to inherit all this weird structure to actually create this, right? And especially considering the fact that it still follows these rules that we've set out for it. And what's cool about this is that it's all right there. There's no other place you have to go to modify this thing. Like you can go in here. There's no like element it can be inside of that can modify it. There's no element that it can contain that can modify it, with a little bit of an exception for like widths and stuff. There's still like sort of like a content like sizing thing going on. But there's no spooky action here. And Phoebe is pleased, of course. So now if we have like a nav bar, the second thing we would actually come to is typography. And you would think, okay, typography, great. We go to Google Fonts, we get a font, and then we lay out our paragraph, and we're going to be good, right? I mean, that seems like, you may have heard that the browser is like the main thing it does is typography, like layout of this stuff. So this is the default for kind of sizing of font sizes, right? So yeah, we have the font size, which is just some number. And then we have this other thing called line height, which is actually the size of the thing, which is default to line height normal, which means basically every font is going to be different and sometimes wildly different. And so it's like, okay, well, font like normal, I guess it could be like line height like auto, I guess. Why do we have this name normal? I don't know. But at the same time, neither of these things are actually the sizes that I want when I'm thinking visually and I want to do layout. Like the things I care about, the sizes I actually care about, if I want to actually reclaim that idea of being able to actually like kind of do math around your layout, like this sort of like went away because we got really focused on like things should just be like flexible. But you realize pretty quickly, like if you have a typeface and like let's say you say like, okay, it's this tall, great, so that means something this tall should like look good next to it. It's like, well, there's a bunch of space above it. It's almost like someone coming up to me and saying like, how tall are you? And I'm like, I'm 7 feet tall, and they're like, you're absolutely absurd. I'm like, no, I'm counting the extra foot. That's me. That's also me. So what would be nice? What would be like a nice way to think about this? And there's basically 2 and maybe 3 sizes that would be really cool if we could just know them. And it's like, okay, the full size, right? From the ascenders to the descenders, like that's a meaningful size. And the other one would be the sized by capital. And this is actually kind of the critical one, because when you want to start to align things, the 2 lines that are actually strongest is going to be the baseline and generally the top of the capital, but you could say the X height, which is the top of the lowercase letters. And it's like, okay, well, if we had this, that's interesting. That's like, so we have some concept of size, but line height is like, when you think about it, it's not the size of the font. It's really you want the spacing between the font, right? I mean, that's when you adjust line height, that's what you're doing. So, well, why don't we just say it like it is, which is that the spacing between the font is just the spacing between the font. And we could actually have 2 versions of this, and I'm still not entirely sure what's best. We could actually say, spacing between, the descender to the top of the ascender, or you could actually say from like the baseline to the top of the ascender, because the baseline of the top one is actually a really strong line, like visually, and that would actually allow us to do some pretty cool, like just make alignment sort of work. We'd have to also make sure that the top line doesn't actually like overlap with the bottom one, but we'll see. So if we have this more precise font size, what happens? Well, here's a normal paragraph. And again, like, I'm not showing you different stuff. Like, these are all kind of the same toggles. I mean, I guess we can do, like, you know, font size. But what's interesting is we can go all the way down so that, like, it's a nicely framed paragraph. And then we can actually, like, independently move the spacing, which feels really good. And then if we want to do something where we actually do want precise font size, we can add a dropped capital. And so all we're doing here is we say, like, oh, like, I got this capital, like, align it to the left, and the font capital size is, and here's this, again, this math is like, it's like Lego math, right? It's like you're like sitting around with your Legos, and you're like, I need a 2x4, please. And, you know, your friend is like, okay, I got a 2x4 blue, and then tosses it over to you. So we have, like, 3 times the body font size and, like, 2 times the spacing. And it just kind of just works out, right? Like, things don't need to be, we don't need to go crazy with it. I skipped a slide. Okay. So what does this actually look like in CSS? Like, you can do this correction in CSS for sure. You have to modify vertical align. You have to modify line height. You have to make sure that the containing block, the containing node is actually a display block, and the actual, like, L or whatever you're trying to modify is display inline block. And you need to actually do this correction. You need to know that vertical align actually will change line height, which was sort of surprising to me. And you also need to figure out, like, okay, but after you've done all this and you've got these, like, fancy little numbers, what if you actually want spacing between lines after doing this calculation, like line height was originally meant to do? It's like, well, there's more math. It's like, okay, well, So basically, line height as a primitive, like as the idea where, you know, if we go back to like this decision to, like, center things and have, like, a bunch of goofiness on top and a bunch of goofiness on bottom, we can't change that. Like, it's not going away. But at the same time, we can't just, like, patch it. We can't just, like, oh, we fixed it once. Because we need to make a correction, which is specific to the font. You do have to, like, per font, this is going to be a little different. And there's going to be a tool that actually will allow you to, like, adjust a little bit. But you'll need to make sure all of those properties that I just mentioned don't interfere with anything else, and you don't touch them. Which actually leads to one of the things that you feel about CSS, which is, like, you inherit it, and usually you don't want to touch it. Like, because, yeah, okay, you can set margin on this stuff, but you actually, this margin may be functioning in multiple different ways, or, you know, this property may be used in multiple different ways. So, what about reuse? This is kind of, like, this was the main thing with CSS, right? I mean, this CSS, I think, came out in, like, 94-ish? I don't know. And the main thing is we had these static documents. I think JavaScript was, like, a year old. And these static documents, so JavaScript was really just, like, some sprinkles on top of stuff. It wasn't really doing anything. And we're like, okay, well, we have this HTML document, but I really, like, I want to be able to say that, you know, this thing is a button that has, like, this color and this whatever. And so, like, you'd say, like, normally you'd have to, like, write that all in line. It's like, okay, and you don't want to write that a bunch of times because we had no method of replication. We had no method of actually, like, capturing an idea. So it's different now because we have functions. Like, we just, like, there's no additional machinery that we actually need once we have functions. So there's kind of this question, which is, why should style be treated any differently than other code in the context of Elm? Partially, it's built into the system that we have needed to. Like, we need to write CSS. We need to like, hook into actually how the browser sort of, like, implements some of this stuff. But conceptually, like, let's like, ignore CSS for the moment. Let's ignore HTML, and let's actually just, like, live in a world where maybe we're just rendering, like, straight to WebGL or something else, which is, like, totally a future. This can happen. What are we bringing along with us? And do we, like, if we're already there, are we going to be happy that we brought it along with us? And this was the main decision with style elements, is actually removing the style sheet. There was a limited idea of a style sheet in the original style elements. It basically eliminated the cascading part of cascading style sheets. And I like now that we're eliminating the sheets part of the cascading style sheets. So, and what I found is what was it buying us? It was this limited style sheet. It was essentially a list of classes. And like every element could have one class. There was no combination, no cascading. It resolved actually a lot of like weird, spooky errors. And like, what do style sheets buy us? Because we're shipping a lot of them, or we can. So this kind of blew my mind. A while ago, I was really, I love the idea of like getting numbers behind stuff, and just to get like the lay of the land of what's going on. And I'm like, okay, well, style sheets, what are people shipping? Like, I was really looking for like, how can you group properties together? Because, it's like, is there a natural grouping with all of these? Turns out, guess what? They're not. There's no real natural grouping. But, fascinatingly, Amazon ships 222,000 style rules. That's not, and this was actually done like a year ago, so who knows what it is now, but that's not like lines of code. That's like a class definition or like an ID definition. And it's like, okay, well, GitHub ships like a lot fewer, but the issue here isn't actually, like you might think it's the mechanical issue of like shipping styles, like asset size. And yeah, sure, but the other thing to think about is how do we think about this stuff? If you have 220,000 things, can you think about it? The English language, like the average vocabulary size, and this is average vocabulary size, is like 35,000. So even if you have 7,000 things, can this be a nice design system ever? And like maybe, I can't say it's not. I can't like say all of CSS, but I know that it can be a very mixed bag. There are all kinds of methods you can actually use to like organize your style in kind of a nice way or not. And not only that, but this is in addition to all of the nodes they're already shipping as well. So it just doesn't seem like a nice way to go. Like I don't know what it buys us. So if we're actually going to like have reuse, what do we actually do? Well, here are like two versions of this card. We have Bardot the Destroyer. And she, like, there's a model behind this, and it's a pretty simple model. And you might think like, okay, well, we have these two different views, and if you were in sort of not Elm land, you may think that this is a single component that needs to basically kind of morph depending on what state it's in. In Elm, I think the easiest way to do this is just like you have a module built around a piece of data that has two view functions, and things are good. But they still look the same, or they look similar, and you want them to visually work out. So if we don't have style sheets, if we say like, okay, well, let's put pause on the style sheets, what do we actually want? It turns out we want something called like a palette. And a palette, in the grand scheme of things, is a set of values that works well with the other values in the set. So think about this as, we have like making impossible states impossible. This is the design version of that. Like, let's have colors that just kind of work together, and let's have spacings that just work together, and let's have typography, which actually, interestingly enough, a typeface itself is just a bunch of glyphs that work well together, so it's already sort of a palette. And once we have that, and we kind of like focus on this, it actually opens up a lot of just like way of thinking. And how big can this get? Can it get can you have 7,000 things in your palette? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it can like top at like 50 things to think about. Talking about like cognitive overload, or cognitive load. Overload, sure. What are some easy ways to do this? Like with a palette, what you really want to do is you want to eliminate values that don't actually make a whole ton of sense and are actually prone to having errors, right? So it's like, oh, every app should have a grayscale. Well, here's the thing. We can just like knock out the middle of the grayscale. And the reason why is because basically especially when you get to the middle, the contrast is usually never going to look good. In fact, actually, when I was trying to do the X's on this thing, I was trying to find like a color to actually make it look good, and I couldn't, so I went with white. Like, it was bizarre. So we have Grayscale. We've eliminated, and we've actually, like, we're only keeping values that we're actually using all the time. And we have, like, font color, right? And let's be fair, we usually have, like, a dark and a light font color, and we have some other font colors, but let's say that those are, like, a little bit a special case. And what's kind of a nice system around this? It's actually not crazy. We just create a function that takes a background color and then chooses one based on the contrast. You can basically just eliminate a whole category of, like, accessibility errors if you just do this. And font color, I was striving for a very long time to figure out what is the system around color for an element that actually, like, is cool. It's like, okay, well, it's like these colors, they all care about each other, and, like, they should, like, live together, I guess. And, like, maybe we only have a style sheet that's like, it's like only like colors. Like, it's like, and when I mean colors, I mean like, oh, this element has this background color, this border color, and this font color, and you had to define everything statically. And that was awful, but this is great. Like, this is really obvious. This is incredibly useful. You can write it. I wrote it in 2 seconds, like 5 minutes before this talk. So spacing, the main thing with thinking about spacing here is that spacing needs to be, in general, nonlinear. We tend, like, as humans, we tend to think of, like, if you try to do linear stuff, we don't see a big difference. It's like 12 pixels versus like 14 pixels. Is that, like, are we going to notice this? It's actually just going to look off in most cases. So the first thing that's really nice to start with is we have sort of a nonlinear progression. And there's a bunch of these progressions. I happen to like this one. And I think it's critical that you don't, I like names. Like, adding real names to this stuff turns out to be like a really good thing just to think about it, right? And so that's what you can do. So after you have this palette, sort of, where can you go with this? It's like, well, we can implement our entire website, right? We can have Cats the Magical Gathering. We have our nice, like, font size. We can have all these, like, cards, which I really, really enjoyed writing. And it just feels good. And if we need to change anything, like, this is incredibly simple, and it should be, right? If we need to change anything, we can go in and we know that there's one view function for everything, and we can just go in and we change it, and guess what? We're sort of done. And we don't worry about getting out of sync because we have this palette, and we're just like, we're always just going to use these values, and they always work together. So how do we know it works? Now, when I am asking this question, I realize it's not that the colors work together. It's more, how do we know that this system of alignment, and we got spacing, and we got kind of like all these different things, this new like design vocabulary, how do we know that it's actually implemented properly beyond just trusting Matt, which is, so what we have here, again, Bardot, and you can see that in her container, she's aligned to the left. That's cool, great, fantastic. So let's think about align left just as like a concept. What have we stated here? We actually know very specifically what there's an expected like intuition around what this does. Like, anybody, you can say like align left, and they're like, yeah. So it knows what it should be doing. Well, could it like test itself? And actually, built behind this system is basically where I've taken the API of Elm UI and mirrored it and made a version that will do two things. It will actually render the actual property. So it will render the actual align left. It will do three things. The second thing, it will assign a unique ID to that node, and it will also declare a test that, if it knew its surroundings, could be run. So what actually happens is, and we do this with every property, it means that we can take any layout specified by Elm UI, and we can just say, like, can you just test yourself, please? And then it is like, hold on one moment, and let's actually see if we can run this thing. Can I run this thing? So this is the full test suite. So what it's doing, you're going to see these like things flashing up there. And it's basically like every word in the vocabulary. I think there are a few that I still need to add. And the reason why it's taking so long on each time is actually that it's a lot of elements, right? It's rendering like all of the permutations. In fact, it's probably going to say like, hey, I think you're, like, what, do you want me to kill this? And no, we're just going to wait. And then we basically get a passing of like all of these concepts. Like we can just guarantee that, this, like all of these layouts that were kind of like fuzz generated, we can run this test suite on any browser that we come across. So, Elm UI. So everything kind of fits together. It's easy to build, and it's easy to change, which means that it's actually fun. I've had a number of people actually even coming up to me like this conference and say, I'm so excited because not only can I do more than I thought I could do, but doing layout is just, it's a joy to actually do this. I can like go and I just implement a layout and it's kind of done and I never have to worry about it and then we're good. And this tweet kind of came out actually only a certain period of time ago, September 11th, I suppose. And he said, like, one day with Elm UI, and I can create UIs more reliably and faster than with CSS after 15 years of exposure and use. I'm really glad he said that, because that's how I've felt for a very long time, but it's one thing for me to say it. It's like, oh, yeah, the language you made is great. I get it. So thank you. This has been about Elm UI. I want to thank Sarah Clancy, who is my speaking coach. She helped me kind of prepare all this stuff. There's a lot of things that you can prepare that are non-technical about speaking, and people can teach you it. That's cool. Also, 8 Shapes is really cool if you want to learn more about design systems. Like, how do you actually, like the actual comment of, like, eliminate the middle grays? That's a fellow from 8 Shapes. And I'm on Twitter at MechElephant. Thank you.